Hey guys, welcome back to our weekly live. Brandon will be here very soon. Let's see. He was having some audio issues and we couldn't hear him. Um,
Can you hear me now?
Maybe the problem's on my end. I can't hear you, Brandon.
Can anybody in the
Ah,
chat hear me?
there we go. Now you're coming through.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
having all kinds of difficulties. So personal and
Hey, you're still
technical.
alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you're feeling a little bit better. Um,
Thanks.
so for these who don't know, Brandon's been sick. He got COVID and a bunch of other stuff all at once. So he's been trying to recover. And then I am coming to you live from a camper trailer because I'm down at our warehouse right now building shelving. And I can see Dabber Dan signed in. I got to meet him in person yesterday. He came by
Awesome.
to pick up some stuff. It was really fun to get to meet some of the people that we talked to on here, or I've seen on Instagram, or seen their plants. So that was great. So yeah, let's you got anything you want to say, Brandon, before we dive in with the questions I see popping up?
No, go for it. I'm just joining the land of the living, so
All right. I
I don't have
do.
much to report.
Oh, okay. I'm going to say I'm not sick. I'm always a little stuffy, but Brandon, yeah, there we go. I just saw the comment from Freedom Born. Um, I do want to talk about powdery mildew really quick because I just released the latest podcast from Dr. Zamir Punja, and I saw that some people were a little upset about our conversation because it was basically about the risks associated with powdery mildew. And we were talking about how it doesn't contain mycotoxins, which are toxins that fungi can produce that are specifically damaging to human health. The most common one that people know of is like black mold that produces mycotoxins that can, cause lung issues, neurological problems. It's very damaging. So it's good in the sense that if you find a little bit of powdery mildew in a spot in your room, you don't have to necessarily throw out your whole harvest. You can, um, remove the affected material, the leaves, to lower your spore pressure, and then you can think about what's causing this issue. So it's a combination of airflow, um, environment, genetics, uh, potentially plant stress through fertility. So how susceptible is that plant? How stressed out is it? Um, and yeah, and then pruning, so canopy management. So if you can keep all of those things optimized, you should be able to avoid powdery mildew indoors. Outdoors is a completely different conversation.
Can I add
But the
one
reason,
thing to one other
yeah, go ahead,
factor?
go ahead.
I'm just because I had a conversation with a grower this morning, and one of the things I talked to him about is spore count in the room. And so, for growers that don't clean their rooms between rounds, you can expect that powdery mildew pressure to just kind of ratchet up a notch every round.
Yeah, some other interesting things about powdery mildew specifically is that it only grows on living tissue. So what's interesting is plants that have the genetic marker for PM resistance. What they're actually able to do is they take the cell that the hyphal tip of the powdery mildew, the mildew infects into, and when the hyphal tip goes into that little tiny cell, it actually the plant kills that cell. So the PM is not able to get any nutrients or thrive or reproduce off of that. So that's how it's able to fight powdery mildew, which I thought was really interesting. And there's actually electron microscopy that shows what this looks like. It's pretty fascinating. Now, botrytis, on the other hand, grows on dead, decaying, necrotic tissue, which is one of the reasons we talk about getting dead leaves, anything that's not alive, out of your grow room to prevent creating an environment that could be conducive for botrytis. That's not to say if you do, what people call chop and drop, or put your fan leaves down onto the soil, that you're going to get botrytis, but it's not necessarily optimal in controlled environment agriculture for that reason. Um, And then the other, I mean, it's a great episode. It was one of my favorite that I've done. He's been on my bucket list of people I've wanted to connect with. I actually drove all the way up to Canada just to hear him speak so I could shake his hand and ask him to come on the podcast because I was so, uh, so excited to meet him. The last big thing that he shared was something that was new to me, and that's essentially that um, fusarium can end up in your flower, in your bud. And that's the reason this is important is because fusarium produces mycotoxins. So it's a lot more dangerous from a human perspective than powdery mildew and botrytis. And I'm not saying smoke flower that's moldy flower. That's not what I'm saying at all. And I don't think that's a good idea in general. But you can know, like, if you were to take, material that was contaminated with botrytis or powdery mildew, you could potentially make edibles out of it or other things that would not be harmful based on the current science. Whereas fusarium does produce mycotoxins. They see this in other crops. He talks about it. And that's where if you see a whitish mold or a pink mold in your flower, in your bud, that could be fusarium. And that's something you're going to want to test for just to make sure, or be very, very careful doing any harvesting in that room because you may not be able to see all of it if it's, just starting to grow inside a flower. Oh, and the one other thing I learned, sorry, last thing, and then we'll move on. I've been gabbing away here. The critical period for botrytis is not at the end of your cycle, according to Dr. Punja. It's actually like week 3, week 4. That's when things are getting a foothold in the flower. And I thought that was really interesting because I just had a power outage right at, week 3, week 4 time. And so I think I'm going to be more susceptible to botrytis this run. So I'm going to have to watch it more carefully. But I thought those were all really interesting things that he shared based on his research.
Yeah, I think that's a big one for growers because I think most folks have been growing for a while have had seen where they've got beautiful plants up until week 7, then all hell breaks loose with fungal pathogens. But what I unfortunately discovered the same thing when I had my facility was that it was actually starting with our mother plants that were in a head house and really babied and cared for and kind of worried over. And
Oh, did you guys just lose Brandon? I just lost him. So I'm going to assume you guys can't see him too. Oh, you're back?
Sorry, I had to go to my phone, and so but yeah, so we found that we tested the mother stock and we actually had it in those plants, although they looked really healthy. And so that was setting us up for, disaster in week 7. And so getting, trichoderma out throughout the round, stuff like Bacillus subtilis, cease, stuff like that. It's really important. Most organic growers have that mindset already where we tend to be proactive rather than reactive growers because this style of growing kind of calls for that, but maybe we forget that message on the IPM side of things, and so it's important to start that at the beginning.
Yeah, I had an interesting call last week. Someone had reached out because they had been told they're in California and they've been told that they had fusarium in their soil, and they had soil outdoor, they had soil indoors. And they didn't have a budget to like replace the soil. And so I started looking into this a little bit and I was saying, this person that told you have fusarium or tested for it, did they give you any more information than that? And they were going to look into that. But essentially, like, and so I went and talked to the Three Rivers Biotech, a pathology lab that tests for this stuff. And I said, look, with fusarium, because commonly, what would happen is you'd plant into that soil, out, and then you would have a plant that would have a vascular problem. You'd say, okay, well, maybe I have fusarium based on what I'm seeing from my plant, and then you would test to see if you had fusarium. Typically, you don't test those first because all of these things, and I think this is the important point here, is all of these things like powdery mildew, botrytis, fusarium, they're ubiquitous. They're in our environment. And so it's really about spore pressure and how healthy you can keep your plants. Now, if you have a lot of fusarium in your soil, then I think there is a higher risk, higher chance of it. But if they're testing for fusarium in living soils, even indoors, the according to the person I talked to at the pathology lab, he said basically he would expect to see probably a positive for it, but because there's all these other antagonisms and beneficial microorganisms, you're probably not going to get a plant infection necessarily. Just it's the same thing with aspergillus. I mentioned botrytis, powdery mildew. So we have to realize, like, we can't exclude these things. We can try and reduce the pressure. Again, it's viroid pressure or spore pressure, and we can try and grow a really healthy plant so that it's less susceptible to these things. But yeah, they're everywhere.
Yeah, no, I would expect to find fusarium in every organic substrate, indoor, outdoor, some. But, just like you said, if we can outcompete those things with productive biology, then we don't have to worry about it for our plants. And if the plants are good VPD, good fertility, they're healthy, not under attack, then like maybe I wouldn't have gotten COVID if I wasn't so stressed out from going to Wenatchee. So there's always extenuating circumstances that go to it.
Yeah, and one of the things was these guys were working. They had reached out to me through because they got my information from a lab that we work with. Um, and so they'd reached out to me to tell me about the problem, but they were already working with someone. And this other person was telling them to apply sulfur to their soils to change the pH and kill the fusarium, which I, I was having trouble on the call, like not criticizing the advice they were getting, but it was pretty wild. Like I can't understand the logic behind either of those things because sulfur is very slow acting in terms of changing pH in soils. And then they didn't even know the pH of the soil to know how much sulfur they were going to plan to apply. And then the guy was trying to sell them these products, which, to be fair, I don't know how good or bad they were, but they did contain some trichoderma. At least one of them did, which I think is would be my approach to remediating this
Right.
thing. But basically, what I told him was like, hey, until you have any evidence that this is actually damaging to your crop, I wouldn't freak out about these results because we don't really know what they're telling us at this point in time. So where I like to see people do testing is if you have a plant that has an issue that you think might be a pathogen, that's a good time to test. I would test for fusarium in flower if I had a botrytis, a bud rot that was a whitish mold or a whitish pinkish mold based on my last conversation with Dr. Punja. I would test for hop latent viroid in a plant, if I saw symptoms that looked similar to that. So, um, yeah, I don't think we need to be just indiscriminately testing either because testing is expensive. I mean, $15 a test, but it adds up. So, um, all right, enough on pathology. Let's get to some of these questions.
Yeah, I can't
Brandon,
see the chat today because I'm on the
okay, maybe
phone.
you can answer this one. With trichomes not being water soluble, but considering heavy rain or spraying with a hose will knock some off, how soon will they be or are they replaced? Let's say 2 to 3 weeks left. And I just want to add a question to this. I feel like trichomes are pretty resilient on plants. I think you would be hard pressed to really damage damage them with a heavy rain or with a hose. Um, Assuming you're not pressure washing your plant. How what are your thoughts on this? Like, and maybe I'm wrong. I haven't looked closely at trichomes to really see what truly damages them, but I've always thought of
Yeah,
them as
so I
resilient.
could imagine if you were pressure washing, like one, I wouldn't be hitting a hose on a plant once it went into flower anyway. So I would skip
Yeah.
that. And then, like when you make bubble hash or, fresh frozen and part of sorry, I can't talk. Part of why we want that all the material when you're making bubble hash, you freeze your material, you get all your tools and implements cold. You want to use the coldest water that you can get. And all of that is about breaking those trichomes off. They get fragile when they're cold and they'll separate more easily. And so, like Tad said, I think that you're probably not losing much in the way from, rain or anything like that. Um, as far as how quickly they would regenerate or you would grow more would probably I can't answer that first. And then secondly, it would probably depend on a bunch of factors. Um, Including plant stresses and things like that that stimulate those. There's some fertility things, there's some stressors that will increase trichomes, and so I think it would have a lot to do with that. um I really, yeah, I don't know, but I wouldn't think that it would knock off a lot from rain. um
I
there's
just want to
not a lot you
comment.
could do about it.
Yeah, 2 to 3 weeks out from finish, if you're getting heavy rains on your flower, that's a huge red flag. I mean, I know you can't control it; it's just the environment, but that makes it really, really optimal because that humidity is getting into that bud and it's just sitting in there, and it takes longer to dry out, and that's when botrytis, bud rot, really gets uh, a foothold and can really spread. So, just really keep an eye on your plants, and then choose genetics that are not going to produce those really big, colas, those arm thick colas, because those are going to have even more humidity inside of them. They look cool, but they're more likely to have problems. So,
Or
all
run
right.
the Chad Westport no joke and you'll get big old colas anyway, and you still won't have pathogen problems. Can't guarantee it,
That's
but
awesome.
it's the most resistant plant I've ever run.
That's really cool. We need that here in the Northwest for outdoor.
Yep.
All right. Fuzzy Bunny says, what are optimal leaf and ambient temps for plants in post stretch flower? Uh,
You want me to
I
jump
would
on
throw out
that one?
78 degrees leaf temp. What do you think, Brandon?
Yeah, so it's good to see you here, Fuzzy Bunny. Thanks for the kind messages, my man. And yeah, so folks know I'm fairly aggressive. I run CO2. I run my room like 82 to 83 for veg and stretch, with par from 1,000 to 1,200, gas probably around 1,000 to 1,200. And so that's fairly aggressive. And then um, actually, Tad, Dr. Ben, and myself were talking. I can't, I've got brain fog from COVID, so I can't remember. It was sometime last week, probably, um, about how we ramp those things down, the CO2, the par, the temperature, and we should be able to share that pretty soon. Dr. Ben and I are actually going to meet about that tomorrow morning. So hopefully that's something that we can just kind of release through KiS. But I would start dialing those back. Um, like Tad said, we want that optimal leaf temp around 78. And so post stretch, I'll usually drop back to 78. And then by the end of flower, I'm down around 75. And so I'm just kind of dropping that down a degree every week as I move into finish, just to, hang on to all those VOCs that I can. But I'm also going to reduce other things in the room. Um,
Mhm.
Hopefully we can share that as a both a doc and a little social media post soon.
That would be great. Yeah. Okay, let's see here.
And that'll cover all those different toggle switches to flip, because it's important. If you move one, obviously we want to move all the others.
Looks like I missed a question here. So, Garage Grower asks, question re-amending soil. Thoughts on planting a cover crop for a couple weeks and then dump it on a tarp and re-amend it all together? Um, I would say my thought is I would rather just start like re-amend and skip the cover crop just to speed things up. I mean, I don't think it's bringing a lot to the table in 2 weeks. That would sort of be my approach to it.
Yeah, because the biology that has to infect the roots of the clover, for example, to start assimilating atmospheric nitrogen, that's going to take a minute to set up, and so I don't think you're going to really accumulate anything. Um, and so I would skip that step and just make it easier. One less thing you have to do.
Um, yeah, I do have a blog post about cover crops. If you type in cover crop on our website or go to the blog page, you can find it if you want to read a more nuanced opinion or longer opinion on cover crops in general. Um, okay, Freedomborn asks, he has questions about FFJ. Uh, I don't know where the question is, so if you want to repost it in here, we can try. But I have to fully admit, I'm certainly not the best person to speak on that technology or that method. I haven't done it. I don't use a lot of KNF. I'm familiar with it, but you'd be much better reaching out to someone like Chris Trump or one of the guys that are much more involved in that world. So okay, are are strains or genes only susceptible to fusarium, or are Aspergillus penicillium just as catchable? Um, yeah, I think all cannabis plants are susceptible to all of these pathogens. It really comes down to plant stress and spore pressure.
And your environment, your ability to, so you look at the IPM triangle, integrated pest management includes pathogens. And so it would be the same thing. And so there's three sides to that triangle. So you have to have a susceptible host, which is cannabis. You have to have the bad actor, whether that's Aspergillus, Fusarium, bot, whatever. We have that. I've got it all over my forehead right now. Like Tad said, like certain things like chop and drop will not cleaning your room between rounds, whatever, can increase your spore pressure, But and then third is maintaining an environment where the plant is susceptible to the pathogen. And so that's really, you know, it's really hard to do exclusion with fungal spores. And so, maintaining an environment and that's not conducive to infection. And that really comes back to your VPD, your air exchange, airflow, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's the same too with pests. Like this is something that Suzanne is really drilled into my head. People say you plant certain plants to deter pests, like mint, for example. And she's like, I've found aphids and all these other pests all over mint. It's all about pest pressure. So if there's enough pest pressure, even your healthiest plant will get eaten by whatever the target pest is. But
Yeah.
if you have a stressed plant or you have a plant that has way more nitrogen than it needs, then yeah, the spider mites are going to go eat that plant first. But that doesn't mean they won't damage. There's no bricks level, there's no healthy enough plant that it can resist pest pressure, provided that's the only food source. So it's the same with pathogens. We try and create as healthy of an environment as possible, but if that pressure is high enough, you can still see damage. It still can get infected.
And we're doing the dumbest form of agriculture. We're doing indoor monocropping. So like if you wanted to try to create an environment that was conducive to pests and pathogens having success, you would do indoor monocropping where they don't have outside natural predators. You would have a single susceptible crop, so since we're doing that, we want to do all the other things right that we possibly can.
Speaking of, have you guys seen, I think it's Yellow Skunk Farms on Instagram? He's got a whole ecosystem I think he's in Virginia, where he's got a little mini pond with a toad in it and like uh, all these different plant species. And it's like a whole ecosystem that he's created. It's really cool. And then he grows these like super long length sativa like cultivars in there. And him and I have been DMing, and I think we're going to do like a YouTube something together to talk about this because he's big into this idea of soil food web and ecosystem, creating an ecosystem. And I think it's really fascinating. And I would love to have kind of a nuanced conversation with him about it. But I know you've seen him, Brandon. You know who I'm talking about, right?
Yep, yep, yep. And I also immediately think of, and I apologize, especially if he's watching, but the brain fog, I just can't think of his name right now. But there's the one guy that's in the Bay Area that had the upstairs apartment grow with, or condo grow, where he had, if he had an 8-foot bed, he had an 8-foot tree cut down and laying across the beds.
Oh, he was
Like,
doing hugelkultur inside
yeah,
in
yeah,
his
it was.
indoor bed. Wow.
Yeah, well, it was just he was trying to make it approximate an outdoor, environment, and that terrifies me because I'm thinking, like, um, oh man, who was it? There was somebody recently reached out to me, and they got like a really bad infestation of some kind of really strange um, pest that just decimated their plants. They look like white maggots. I can't think of what it was. It was something that we never see. Finally figured it out. He had been taking all the peels from his outdoor vegetable garden and just peeling them into his beds, and somehow, whatever this thing is came in on it. I talked to an entomologist who was like, oh yeah, that's probably the only way you could get that into an indoor garden. And
Hmm.
so, some of these things that we feel like are, I'm as guilty as anybody, as the crystal hugging hippie over here, that there's things that, like, I want to do, they feel good. But the scientist in me is like constantly smacking my hand and saying, don't do that, Um, and so if in doubt, I listen to the scientist on my shoulder as opposed to the
Yeah, I
other
think it's
shit.
Yellow Skunk Farms, and I apologize if I'm saying the name wrong,
No, I
because
think that's
I'm
right.
doing
I
it off
think
the top
that's
of my
right.
head. But I don't think he would say, and again, I haven't talked to him about this yet, but I don't think he would say that he's trying to optimize, uh, yields with his setup.
No.
But what he's created is this like cool room that you can go into, you can grow weed, and you have all this other stuff happening that kind of cycles. And it's very cool what he's doing. So I certainly don't, I'm certainly not saying anything negative about it. Um,
Yeah, if I ever hit the lottery, it'd be the dumbest thing in the world, but you can guarantee I'll have a creek running through my house. Like, that's
oh,
been
see,
on my bucket list since I was about 4 years old, and I would do it.
I went and visited the butterfly gardens up in Victoria, and I talked to my wife. I was like, if I could recreate something like this in a greenhouse in our yard, I absolutely would. So then I asked Suzanne about it, and she's like, oh, they're constantly having to bring in new butterflies, and it's this whole thing, and it's really hard. And I was like, ah. But
Can I?
having like a cool ecosystem like that, would be really awesome.
So so this ties back to cannabis. So I used to work for a lady named Freddie Arthur, and Freddie used to run the Butterfly Barn in McClellanville, South Carolina. If anybody's ever read the book Gentleman Smuggler about Barry Foy, and that group of guys, they were a bunch of smugglers who were bringing in cannabis from Central and South America, the Caribbean, and they were bringing it in on, bring it in on shrimp boats, um, and then offload it in, all of South Carolina's coast, but, especially up around McClellanville, it's all these little inlets and stuff, and it'd be pretty near impossible, especially back then, to monitor those waterways. And so that was how they were bringing that in. Um, Freddie got a visit from DEA to the butterfly barn because it was in very close proximity to where Barry and those guys were unloading all their stuff. And so she was pretty straight laced, and it shook her pretty bad. And but she would tell me stuff about the butterfly barn, and she really enjoyed it. They did a lot of kid field trips and stuff, but she said that they had to constantly reintroduce
Yeah, I could see
butterflies.
that.
But yeah, so yeah, if anybody's ever read that book, Barry Foy was my old landlord, and I've got some crazy stories about that guy. He was a wild man.
Right on. So Dabber Dan says he's doing something similar to biomimicry, which, to be fair, is something that I push back on a lot in our industry because I think people misapply or misabuse that term. but I think what he's doing is unique, and I think it's pretty cool. He also looks like he solarizes the material as well, the soil before he brings it in. So hopefully he's killed off some of those pests and pathogens. So I think that's a smart approach given what he's doing. All right,
I
let's get back to the
follow a
questions.
I follow a guy on YouTube who makes these really cool indoor terrariums and stuff and aquascapes, and he talks a lot about how he, if he's got driftwood, if he's got whatever, he boils it, he does some sort of heat treatment or, freezes it, he'll do something before he'll take a big bag of leaves and boil them like you're making tea just to make sure that he's starting off pretty clean and he can control
Yeah.
that. I brought in a friend of mine, Sarah Marhanke, who I've told some stories about her because she was a trimmigrant for years and had some pretty wild experiences. But she gave me this really cool. We were surfing buddies, and she gave me a cool sign, handmade sign that she brought back from Costa Rica. I don't know how she got it back as a wooden sign, but I was super excited. It was a Gone Surfing sign, and I put it on my front porch, and it immediately started just pouring out probably termites, but some kind of bugs. And I didn't want
Ooh,
to get rid of it. And so back to Freddie Arthur, she was like, "Oh, freeze it. That'll kill them." And so I threw it in the freezer for a couple of weeks and didn't have any problems with it.
nice. All right. Back to the questions. Dabberdan asks if you have healthy soil, can poor calcium uptake be a sign of poor airflow and VPD management? Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what it is. You nailed it. So yes, um, it's primarily calcium travels through the xylem,
Yep.
so which is the same pathway as water. So if your plant is having trouble with transpiration due to your environment or airflow, then yes, that is what you'll see. All right, can you use beneficial spores? I would just say microbes in flour to fight the pathogens. So, yeah, there's some bacillus species, trichoderma, things that you can use to fight these pathogens. But a lot of states, if you're growing in a regulated market, don't differentiate between beneficial microbes. They just look and pathogens. They are ones that are harmful to humans. So there you have to be a little more careful, but yes, absolutely. And there's a lot of great options. We try not to apply anything to a plant once we're past like week 2, week 3 of flower. Ideally, you get a really healthy plant and you're not having to spray anything in flower. You might do a beneficial insect release um, going into flower or something. But after that, you don't have a lot of tools really left in your toolbox once you have trichomes starting to form.
And with pathogens, like we mentioned at the onset of this pod, is if you don't start early, you're not going to have corrective action at the end. Like they're not going to, if you see fusarium showing up in week 7, there's not, applying cease or trichoderma or anything, might cause you to fail, but it's really not going to correct anything either at that point. It's too late. You really need to take a prophylactic approach to that.
Sorry, I was reading some of the other questions here. Is there any benefits to growing mushrooms near your cannabis, and would the spores be an issue to the flowers? Um, I mean, mushrooms are a sign of healthy soil, but they're not necessarily doing anything directly to your cannabis plant, and vice versa. I don't think the spores would be any issue for your flower. So
Yeah, it's not going to hurt anything. The only thing that I think of is that because there's like the common greenhouse mushroom, that little yellow mushroom that everybody's seen. There's certain mushrooms we all see from time to time. Don't let your cover crop, don't let your mushrooms, don't let any of that stuff be more important than your cannabis if cannabis is what you're trying to grow. And so, like I would want a more moist environment for mushrooms than I want for cannabis. And so,
mm,
I'm not going to try to cultivate. mushrooms productively and cannabis at the same time, that's not going to work out. So prioritize one thing and grow that, and then if other things show up and they're not hurting anything, that's fine. But
Yeah, I've thought about, it would be great to be able to grow some veggies or some other edible crops in my grow room with just some of the light coming off the side. But to me, because I'd have to bring in a plant or bring in a soil at some point mid cycle, I just don't want to risk it. I don't want to bring any soil into my garden once I have like right now, this cycle, I know last cycle I had really bad thrips. This cycle, things have been very clean of pests. And so, like, I don't want to risk bringing in fungus gnats or thrips or anything in there. So, um, yeah, I would keep them separate for the most part, indoors. Outdoors, knock yourself out. Like, yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think growing
yeah.
mushrooms is great. So, can bad mold buds still be used in anaerobic teas? I wouldn't use them for anything. You could compost them. One guy, I got into it a little bit with a guy on Instagram because he's like, I won't even compost that shit. Like, it's so bad, get it out of there. And I was like, compost it. Why not? Like, assuming you're composting outdoors, there's already gonna be all of those spores. Like I already said, they're ubiquitous in your environment. So the compost is a great place for anything moldy
And
already.
if you're technically composting correctly, you go through a thermal process to
Sure.
just destroy those. And so there's a difference between throwing stuff outside and just letting it rot and composting. And I think that
Well,
sometimes that's not a,
that is a form of
nuanced.
composting. It's static composting. You're talking about thermophilic composting, where you balance your C to N ratios, your greens to browns, and it heats up and you turn it. But yeah, I mean, I just think I wouldn't take that compost and put it back in my room
No, no. But
indoor. But like,
outdoors,
yeah,
yeah.
mix it with some
I,
chicken manure, and then make some compost for your ornamental plants or your landscape. It would be great.
yeah, yeah. But I wouldn't use them in a tea or anything back into my room, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. You just got people have to be careful what you bring back into your room. Daberdan, looks like your question came through twice, so it did show up. All right, what are the difference between mammoth pea and microbial mass? That is a phenomenal question, and I'm actually going to sit down with Colin, the founder of Mammoth Pea, which is now back on the market. We just added it back to our website. Um, he currently works for microbial mass. He went to work there after Mammoth Pea went out of business. Um, Long story there. The quick version is there were investors. They had different vision for the business. Colin just recently got the business back, but they took it in a direction that he couldn't really necessarily control. And long story short, they ended up going under. And so now he has Mammoth Pea back and he's selling it through, I think, Grower's House. And so we're able to distribute it as well. Um, Boy, I think they're both good products. I don't know. I think I have a fond preference for Mammoth Pea just because it was the first thing I looked at under the microscope that was actually like a microbial product that was obviously alive, which I thought was pretty cool. And you can check out that video on YouTube if you type in Mammoth Pea on our KiS Organics channel. You can see some of the microscopy work I did. Um, but they're both consortia of beneficial bacteria that help cycle nutrients and unlock phosphorus. I don't know which one's better at it. I don't know if I've seen side by side trials. Maybe Colin can share more information. I would use whichever one was more affordable for you to source at this point in time. Um, yeah. Anything to add, Brandon? Or
I've used them both, and I think of them as interchangeable. I think that a lot of growers prefer for their workflows the microbial mass because it's biweekly instead of every week, and
mm,
that as somebody like myself who likes to tinker and I'm constantly trying to add things. Um, that's one less watering, because that's one thing I was like, and I think Little Nugs has asked this question before, like, can I add my microbial mass or my mammoth pea to a compost tea? And we recommend doing those separately so they don't become, because that's an expensive targeted bacteria, and so we don't want it to be a food source for other things. We want it to actually get into the substrate. So that's like the grower notes that I've the conversations I've had with folks, but I feel like they're both very effective.
Yeah, we did a trial with Mammoth Pea way back in the day at Gold Leaf Gardens, and I was surprised that they got a statistically significant bump in yield. Given that I knew their soil was biologically active, it was the first trial I'd ever seen in living soil with Mammoth Pea, and so that kind of what made me a believer in these sorts of products. So yeah, and the microbial mass, I know the guys who founded it. It was a friend of mine, David Bernard Peron's roommate from college, who went to work at a lab, and I think they got formulated out of the soil that David had created up in Canada. So, uh, yeah, I think use which one is easier. Okay, let's see here. I am Louisiana asks, planning on starting my first grow here soon. Congratulations. Thanks for tuning in. I'm impressed that you found us because usually people don't start with us. Usually they kind of make their way after having grown for a while because we tend to be a little more, I think, advanced or technical than most. So appreciate you tuning in. I plan on using Mother Earth groundswell as my soil base, one third and one third compost, and about 15% pumice or perlite. Sounds good for living soil. Um, I don't know what Mother Earth groundswell is. I assume it's a soil mix. Mother Earth is owned by Scots, which someone mentioned, which may or may not be an ethical thing. Some people in this industry try to avoid them for good reason. And then my only other thought would be 15% pumice. Typically, about a third of your mix is pumice or perlite.
Yeah.
But if Mother Earth groundswell is a soil mix, it's already going to contain some aeration. So maybe 15-20% is sufficient. I, but I don't know. And then the size of the perlite or pumice makes a difference too. And then you don't really know without a soil test about your fertility. So trying as a new grower, trying to make your own soil for the very first time can be a lot of fun. And if you have an inquisitive mind and you're okay with failure, I'd say go that route. It's great. If you want something a little more tried and true, then go with a company who's making a product that you trust, and get a living soil from them so you know you're starting from something that's at least been tested and other people have had success with. Because if I were designing a soil, there's a few things you have to think about. The first thing is the physical properties of that soil, which we were talking about there, in terms of like gas exchange, aeration, water retention, drainage, good pore space for roots. So that's the first thing. It's just the physical properties of it. The next thing is the sort of the biological properties, which is where that's why we use compost or earthworm castings, is to get that good beneficial biology in there. And then lastly, the chemical properties of the soil. And chemical doesn't mean synthetic. Chemical just means nutrients. So what levels of nitrates and phosphorus and
Elements.
calcium
What
and
elements are in
magnesium.
that soil?
Yeah, and what are those ratios? And are they at sufficiency? Are they balanced? And so all of those things have to come together to create a good quality living soil. So it's complicated. Fortunately, a lot of people have had good success just kind of because organics is more forgiving. You can sometimes just throw it all together and still grow a healthy plant. But there is just a higher level of risk with that.
Yeah. I like to do a base mix so I get my tilth right and then test and add fertility to match my targets. And a lot of the mixes, like one of the reasons, like I'll plug KiS, like, I know that we try to be brand agnostic, but I love how chunky our perlite is and how well our soil drains.
Pumice.
Uh, Pumice,
Use
sorry, yeah,
pumice.
yeah, pumice, not perlite. But I had to grab a bag of Happy Frog. I'll tell on myself the other day, just in a pinch. I asked my wife to grab it from a store, and because I'm getting out of this root aphid problem, and so I've got all my mother stock, and 90% of it's in KiS soil, and 10% of it is in Happy Frog, and everything in the Happy Frog side is just struggling. It's all yellow. It's all struggling, and it's just there's not a lot of fertility in there to start with, but there's no porosity. Their perlite, it might as well just be just throw some dust over the top and call it a day. There's no
Hmm.
drainage, and so those are drying down really slowly to the point where I can't even feed them. Because these are all in fairly small pots, so I'm feeding with fish. It should be easy, they should all be the same, but the the simple fact that the tilth is so much different, so much more compacted. It's a real easy visual when you walk in the room. That one corner is just ugly.
Yeah,
So
you
that's
never told
crucial to
me
get
you were
that dialed in.
growing in Happy Frog. All good, man.
One bag.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to tell on myself. I like to tell
I would
people when
have.
I screw up and when I break the rules. And um, I've had a couple of conversations with growers over the past. Well, I always have these conversations, but I've had a couple of kind of heartbreaking conversations with a couple of growers lately that are just taking the L's really hard. And it's cultivation. And so I like to tell on myself when I blow it, just because I think that it takes a little pressure off of newer growers.
All right. Jamie Smith asks, looking to start in a mother area. Wish I could say a room or a tent, but should I aim for regular veg temps, VPD, par? Okay, so essentially you're asking is like, should you treat your mother room like you would a veg room? Um, yes.
Yes, and with this caveat, a lot of times if you're using a tent as your mother room, which I've done tons and still do sometimes, um, it's real easy to outgrow that space. And so you end up cloning and cloning and cloning just to kind of keep smaller plants. So if you're growing too fast, you can slow things down a little bit. You could back off your temp, back off your light a little bit, and just slow the plant down. And so that's just one thing to think of. So if you find yourself outgrowing the space before you need to take more cuts, think about throttling things back a little bit. But typically, definitely for a facility, I would say yes.
All right, Little Nugs asks, when using powdered humic acid, should I be mixing it first or last when using it to bind hard water, chlorine, or when trying to bind in nutrients?
I would add it last, but it doesn't really matter.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
don't have any
the
thoughts
only
or know
reason
the
I would add
chemistry on
it
that.
first is for, and I think the nerdy folks in here know that, EC for a salt solution versus the EC of an organic slurry or whatever, it's not going to be as accurate. But those are still impactful numbers that we like to look at. And so if you're mixing something up and you're really uptight about your metrics and that kind of stuff, I would, get your solution, get your metric, and then add it just so that you don't get that doesn't impact it. But
Homegrower 39 asks, how important is it to manage CO2 levels at night? I built a sealed room to help contain CO2, but didn't think how much is produced with living soil beds. I would add, and your plants at night are going to also produce CO2. So you're getting hit twice there. Um, Brandon and I have slightly different views on this. You want to go first, Brandon?
so I think it's important if you're a home grower. It's not the end of the world, because the biggest thing that you're going to see is something that we call night growth, which is where you have excessive CO2 during the night and excessive CO2. We know excessive CO2 will delay senescence, so that's important. That's impactful for any grower, home or scale. Um, but at home, you're just going to see these flushes of nice white new pistils on an otherwise finished bud. So that can impact your bag appeal and that sort of thing. Um, but for me, I think it's important just because it will delay finish. That's the bigger
Oops.
impact for me. Because we'll see it
Um,
jump up from ambient to like almost 4,000 with lights off, and that's way more than I would run normally, even when I'm pushing things.
yeah, right now I'm seeing 1,000 to 1,300 in my grow room. Um, so I'm not too worried about it, and I don't have a great way to exhaust because if I exhaust my room at night because it's in a garage, it's going to drop my temperature so far that it's going to push me out of VPD range, and then I don't know that I can get back up into range, given just the challenges of my room setup. So it's one of those things you have to kind of think about your setup for. Um, Speaking of, I do want to just plug my grow sensor. It it's been allowed me, like right now I'm gone. I've been checking on my room continually, and being able to see CO2, light, VPD, leaf VPD, and then the big one for me lately is like because I'm not there watching my moisture. My blue mats went from 32% to 36% in a bed, and I was like, oh, maybe there's a flood, but because it jumped 4% pretty quickly. And so I just had my wife go in and turn off the blue mat sensor in that one bed just in case. Um, it hadn't flooded. It hadn't flooded, but I was like, that's a little wetter than I want it to be. I'm just going to turn it off. I'll be back, late tonight or tomorrow. I can sort it out. So I love having that kind of thing. And then the other thing I saw was I had, speaking of telling on yourself, I shared a photo on Patreon. One of my timers like fried, like it straight up burned the timer. And so could have started a fire. It was dangerous. But my grow sensor showed that the light level obviously dropped and my DLI dropped. And like had I set an alert on there, it would have sent me a notification telling me that a push notification telling me that my light was outside of whatever parameter I'd set. So I wish I had done that. Um, so I do find it to be a pretty cool little tool. I'm pretty excited now. I'm going to share my review here on YouTube either this week or next week. I did one in conjunction with Grow Sensor to release it, and we do have them now here in the U.S. For sale. If people are interested, reach out. They're not cheap, but they use really high quality sensors and they give really good information. So since we were talking about CO2, I just want to mention that. Okay. I'll let you do this one, Brandon. This is a great question. What would be the major difference in prescription for a Malic 3 test? So that's a standard soil test, acid extraction, when doing native soil versus soilless peat? Example, let's say so potassium or calcium are low.
Okay, so there's two basic ways that you interpret soil tests, or two traditional schools. One is for in situ, in the field soils that actually have a true clay colloid and true humic fractions. We don't have that in a manufactured substrate, and so it acts much more like a solution. And so if I'm going to, if I've got a soybean farmer or an outdoor cannabis grower that's in the field, I'm going to do those numbers differently, because essentially what we're doing is pulling we pull everything off the clay colloid and kind of reverse engineer those numbers. If if I do that with, that, like, that's why organic matter percentage, um, some of the other things, total exchange capacity, those numbers on a Malick soil report for a manufactured substrate are going to be inflated. I think that most everybody who does testing sees that their organic matter percentage is almost always 20% or higher. If you've got 4% organic matter in a field soil, you're doing really well. And so um, we get an inflated kind of view of what's in the soil if we look at it that way. And so, um, yeah, it's just two different totally different processes and different metrics, different math. And it's mainly just because we don't have a true colloid that is actually capable of holding fertility. So when I balance for field, or let me back up. If I'm balancing for a substrate, I'm not trying to, I'm trying to put, especially for cannabis, monocropping indoors, I'm trying to hit certain targets for the round. Outdoors, when I look at that clay colloid and the physical makeup of the soil, the sand silt clay, what makes up the loam, that you're growing in, that's going to tell me a lot of information. And so, for example, if you've got a sandy soil versus a clay soil, you are going to have better drainage, but you're not going to be able to hold on to much fertility. And so for a grower like that, I'm going to have to do multiple applications at lower frequent or lower rates throughout the season. Where if I've got an outdoor grower who's got, primarily clay, they're not going to drain as well. I need to get more calcium in there to physically flocculate and open that soil. But I also know that I can put a good deal more nutrients into that substrate, or not a substrate, into that actual field soil, because it can actually hold on to it. It'll have, the charge to hold. We don't have the same, there's things that act like colloids in manufactured substrates, but not to the nearly any impactful degree that we see in an actual in situ field soil. So I don't know if I answered that or not. I think I did.
I don't know. I don't know if you did either. You kind of jumped around, but
Yeah.
yeah, there are major differences in how you approach soil versus a soilless mix. Your targets are going to be different. Some of the numbers on the tests are going to be erroneous. Like Brandon was saying, for a soilless test, like we can ignore CEC, we can ignore organic matter percentage. Ideally, you would use both the saturated paste and the standard test. And don't do the AA 8.2 test that I see some people recommending. Soil Doctor doesn't do it. We don't do it. Bill McKibben doesn't do it. So none of the people that I look up to in that world would do it. So keep that in mind.
And I will
All right.
operate just off of Malic for an outdoor field soil. I don't need the paste like I do for a substrate. You can skip the paste for an outdoor.
Right on. Okay. We all right. We got to go speed round. We only got 2 minutes left, and I
Okay.
can't run long today. All right, so let's do
Yeah.
these fast. Read a post about how mulch helps prevent PM because the post said that PM lives on the top layer of soil, but Brandon has gotten me away from mulching indoors. Is that true? Um, Not that he got you away, but that PM lives on the top layer of soil.
I mean, it most certainly could, but it could also live on that mulch layer. Um, that's one of the reasons I don't like cover crops and mulch indoors. Creates this really moist microclimate right below your plants, which is conducive to powdery mildew, aspergillus, fusarium. So I would I would skip it. I would be concerned. I don't think that mold, like mulch works as a good physical barrier outdoors. Like most of the issues that happen with tomato plants, blights, early blight, late blight, all that stuff splashes up from the soil. So it's really important to do bottom watering and with like soaker hoses or something like that. And it's important to have mulch around those plants. Um, Indoors, it's a different scenario, and I think you create more pressure than you would relieve.
Yeah, I'm not aware that this to be true. So
Yeah, I
I
don't
can't
think
speak
that's
to it.
true either. Yeah,
But yeah, maybe I can ask Dr. Nicole Gauthier because I do have a conversation with her coming up.
awesome.
All right. Real fast. Yes, you can absolutely use calcium silicate or molassinite, and you can use organic inputs like minerals, and we don't use a lot of vitamins. But yes, you can use any of the things that you would with any living soil if you're buying the Westport blend. Um, Can lower leaf temperature indoors be a sign of poor plant metabolism or health? Um, I've always associated leaf temperature with something that I've controlled in my environment based on uh, the heat, the temperature in the room that I created, as well as the radiant heat coming off of the lights. I'm not aware of the plant being able to regulate that at all. So I would say no. The lower leaf temp is a sign that you might need to make adjustments in your grow space to improve your environment.
Your plant can do certain things to reduce temperature, but they're all negative, in the grand scheme of things. And so you would just want to, I agree with Tad 100% here. I would just raise my temperatures in the room.
How do you treat excess K excess, too much potassium and low pH? You're probably going to have to add calcium in the form of agricultural lime or oyster shell flour. They're both calcium carbonate.
Or
And
gyps.
well, I wouldn't. If your pH is low, I would add gyps. I wouldn't add gypsum just because we probably want to raise it. Otherwise, if your pH
True.
was neutral or high, then yes, gypsum. Um, but again, it depends on how low, how much of an excess of K. Are there plants in it already? If not, you could just flush and kind of start over. A lot of variables there. Wavy and wrinkly leaves on seedlings is a sign of what, in your opinion, Brandon?
I mean, I get so many photos and calls about seedlings, and seedlings tend to a lot of times be kind of funky because they're at this really super stressful, important part of the plant's life, where we're not providing a lot of fertility. And so, it could be a trace element, it could be calcium, it could definitely be related to environment. So it could be a lot of different things. Um, yeah,
Genetics. I would
yeah,
lean towards environment. That's like humidity is the first thing that I would think of for that. But again, there could be a lot of different things.
yeah. There's just so many factors. It's like leaf angle. Like what is it? A touch me not, the sensitive plant. It's got different physical characteristics from some plants, and so it has different mechanisms for leaf angle. There's just so many factors there.
Yeah. Okay. Really fast now. Speeding up even faster. Uh, Little nugs. If everything's running smoothly, you don't have to soil test. That's the thing. But if you want to know for sure how where you're at in your soil testing is the only way to know that. How often should you be applying silica? It depends on the form of the silica. You could just add molasses at the beginning of the grow cycle, or you could be adding something like potassium silicate up to weekly, which leads to the next question. You can add it up to weekly. One thing I did learn from Dr. Zamir Punja is that you can overdo it with silica and it will actually come out through the leaf itself, what he called leaf trichomes. Um, I'd never heard of that, but apparently, and there's a paper linked on the podcast page for his podcast that I released that talks specifically about how excess salts will come out of the leaves in cannabis when over applied, which was something I'd never heard of. Okay, running under canopy lights for the first time. Um, what you want to think about? I just did a cycle. You can check out the video on YouTube. I left all my bud sites on my plant, and I just took away fan leaves to create. Just think the whole time you're pruning, just think light and air, light and air. So as long as you're getting light penetration and you're getting good airflow through your canopy, top to bottom, then you should be good to go. But I did not prune nearly as aggressively as I would with top lighting. Organic farming, I just want to say I would push back on this a little bit. Living soil and soil tests, I think, go together great. Organic farmers all test their soil. If you're a market farmer, that's the information. That's the key piece of data that you're using to make decisions in your garden. It's a tool. It's something that we like to use as growers as well. So I would just push back on that and say I think they go together really well. It's just because we're organic doesn't mean we can't utilize science. And science is the best tool we have for understanding our physical environment and how plants grow.
I work with a lot of market gardens locally to make sure that they're squared away for the season.
Yeah, so here was Little Nug's advice. He just said he just said anything lower than his lights he takes out. I have my lights right at ground level, so um, I left a little bit more than that, but I think this is really good advice too.
Think of it as just you have the ability to make your canopy deeper. That's how I like to think of under canopy lighting. You're doing a 2-tier and a 1-tier.
Yeah. Sorry, I went back to the comment section really quick. Okay, last couple questions. Can you flower out 3 gallons and still have good results? You can, but you're going to have to be really, really good at what you're doing, and you're potentially going to need to feed the plant continually, like you would if you were doing a salt grow. You really would have to treat it like that because there's just not enough volume of soil. Your plant can get root bound, which also creates nutrient uptake issues. It's very challenging. That's all I want to say. So I wouldn't recommend it to a new grower. If you're experienced and you plan on doing a organic bottled nutrient sort of feeding cycle or using fish hydrolysate, yeah, you can do it. And then if peat moss is soilless and you're adding gypsum, basalt, oyster shell, and worm, what do you pH to? Our target pH is 6.8. If you are 6.5 to 7.2, 7.3, you're probably just fine for the type of media that we're using in living soil.
Yep.
And I think that is just about it. Yes, organic farming. I've seen some of your comments in here. USD organic is not the same as organic. There are nuances. AgSil 16H is a great example of that. If you want to be purely organic and not use any inputs that were at all modified or created by humans, I think that's really challenging. I think that's a nuanced conversation. Because everything gets processed, and how you view that processing based on your ethics is a much more complicated conversation. When you utilize science, it just doesn't mean you fully grasp the science involved. I think we have a pretty good understanding of soil testing in relation to cannabis cultivation. We have targets that we know work over and over again. And we know this because one of the things about an experiment in science is you look at a methodology and then you replicate it. And if it can be replicated in a number of different environments by a number of different people, that's really what science is. And that validates your methodology, which in this case is soil testing, because we have people that are doing this literally all around the world now. So it's been great. Okay, well, I don't have time to get into your Root X States comments here. I see you're typing a bunch of comments, and I just can't keep up. I do have to get going here. I will just end by saying pH matters. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more next live. Unfortunately, though, we do have to go. Brandon's sick, and I got to go finish building shelving in our warehouse so we can get everything set up and ready to go. But I appreciate the comments and questions. I appreciate all you guys. This was a lot of fun, and have a great rest